So welcome to today's Mackinder Forum. I'm Len Hochberg, the U.S. coordinator of the forum. Our talk will be recorded. Before introducing our guest, I'd like to remind everyone on this call that we adhere to the Chatham House rule, which applies to the question and answer session to follow the talk. The Chatham House rule states participants are free to use information from the discussion, but they are not allowed to reveal who made any particular comment or mention what organization they represent. Regarding the Q&A period to follow the talk, the organizers request that participants limit themselves to one question at a time. If you have a second question, we'll circle back to you after everyone has had a chance to ask their question. Finally, if you did not have an opportunity to introduce yourself during the meet and greet session prior to the lecture, please do so briefly before asking your question. Our guest today is Stephen Mosher. He is an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues, as well as an acclaimed author and speaker. He has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs and has helped hundreds of thousands of women and families worldwide over the years. Steve is also the author of the best-selling A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy. His other books include Hegemon, China's Plan to Dominate Asia and the World, China Attacks, China Misperceived, American Illusions and Chinese Reality, Journey to the Forbidden China, and Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese. Articles by Steve have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the Washington Post, National Review, Reason, and numerous other publications. I've known Steve for 40 years, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him today. Stephen Mosher, please begin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Len, for that very kind introduction. Since that particular bio was written, I have published a couple more books. One was Bully of Asia, published in 2017, republished in 2022, and again, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, pointing very early on that the COVID virus obviously came from the Wuhan lab, but equally obviously that lab was funded and equipped with the technology to create that virus in a great blunder by the famous Dr. Anthony Fauci. And more recently, I published a book called The Devil and Communist China. So the question before us today is a question that has been posed many times since the turn of the century. And that is, I think, the question of great moment for all Americans and for all Chinese and for all the people of the world. And that is to say, will the 21st century be the second American century or the century of China? Now, so the rapid rise of China over the last few decades has encouraged a cottage industry of pundits who say that it's only a matter of time until that country would overtake the United States in military might and economic power. One of our participants today said correctly that allowing the People's Republic of China into the WTO was a strategic blunder of the first order. I would say that it was probably the greatest strategic blunder that any country has made in human history, enabling the rise of the country that wants to destroy it. But I think the predictions for China's rise have been greatly overblown, in part fostered by the notion that the proper role of the American political establishment was to oversee the gradual decline of the United States, that America's best days were over, that China's rise was inevitable and we should simply reach some sort of accommodation, some sort of concordat with China, dividing the world into spheres of influence and so forth. I was reminded when I first heard those comments of the predictions of Paul Samuelson in his Introduction to Economics, which was the Bible for introductory economics courses throughout the United States in the 70s and 80s, in which in each successive edition for probably 20 years, he predicted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States. And he had to keep modifying the graph, you see, because the point at which the Soviet economy would exceed the US economy kept having to be moved back. He did not understand. He was very impressed by the command aspects of the economy, but he did not understand the corruption, the disillusionment, the demoralization of the Russian people under communism, which in the end proved to be the breaking point that shattered the Soviet Union. And I think in the same way, a lot of people viewing China from the outside see this indomitable, unified mass of people marching forward happily into a communist future, guided by the vanguard of the proletariat, the Chinese Communist Party, into a great and glorious future. And of course, that's not how the reality of China looks on the ground at all. I happen to be exposed to that reality in a very personal way. Back in 1979, I was at Stanford University with Len and Jimmy Carter. I was actually working on my PhD thesis in anthropology, cultural anthropology, writing it on a study of rural life in Taiwan, of all the innocuous topics to be studying, when on January 15th of 1979, then President Jimmy Carter announced that we were normalizing relations with the People's Republic of China. Now, as it happened, I had been in the US Navy as a junior officer in 1973 when we made a port call to the city of Hong Kong. And I traveled to the border and looked across the border from what was then British-controlled Hong Kong into the rice paddies of Shenzhen, and saw the villagers in their black, drab Maoist garb, wearing their conical woven straw hats, working in the fields as they had for not just centuries, but millennia. And I was drawn to the study of China. So once I resigned my commission in 1976, I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong and studied Mandarin Chinese. I was living with a family in Hong Kong, however, who spoke Cantonese from morning to night. So it was total immersion in two different languages at the same time, which I would not recommend to anybody. I also had a relationship with a woman in Hong Kong at the time. And when China opened up in 1979, I went with her to a village where her family had come from in the Pearl River Delta. And so I was there in March of 1979. My senior advisor thesis advisor at Stanford, Dr. Bill Skinner, said to the National Security Council and the other people overseeing the scholarly exchange program that I have someone already in China. Why don't we send him there as an official exchange scholar? And so it was that I spent the next year of my life in a village in South China along the Pearl River Delta, among people whose language I could speak, and I could read and write Chinese as well. And they taught me some very interesting things about the system that they were then living under, which had been largely closed to the West for the previous 30 years. They referred to the Chinese Communist Party, somewhat to my surprise, as the big landlord. And now, landlord is a term of opprobrium in the Chinese Communist Party lexicon. Landlords were among the chief counter-revolutionaries who had to be eliminated by the Chinese Communist Party when they pretended to redistribute land to the villagers with, of course, the intention of not letting them keep it, but merely seeing that as a transitional stage into the commune system, which was imposed a few years later. So to call the party the big landlord was not in any way flattering. They also took me out to the local killing field where officials of the nationalist regime and members of the village militia had been taken out and shot when the Red Army arrived in the village in Pearl River Delta in the latter part of 1949. And they told me other things about the ongoing political campaigns that had been launched one after the other by the Chinese Communist Party against the people. But another pivotal moment, of course, was the beginning of the one-child policy, which I was an eyewitness of in the spring of 1980. And I must tell you that the sight of the Chinese Communist Party declaring that women who were pregnant with their second, third, and fourth children were carrying illegal children, and that they were to be told to go into medical centers for an abortion. And if they refused, they were to be arrested and locked up and propagandized in brainwashing sessions until they consented in quotes, to the abortion, was another eye-opening experience for me. And I realized at that moment in the operating room when they were doing cesarean section abortions on women who were 9 months pregnant and killing babies born after birth because these were illegal children who could not be allowed to live, that the Chinese Communist Party was basically, I think like all communist parties, a war party. It was organized for war. It was it maintained the muscular tone of the system by constantly choosing enemies, and kind of a living example of the thesis antithesis of Hegel. So there always had to be an enemy, and an enemy without, an enemy within, and that's what the purges and persecutions of the 50s and 60s were about. That's what the Cultural Revolution and succeeding campaigns were about. And of course, that was what the one-child policy was in one sense about. The Chinese people, unborn children for the first time were declared to be, in a sense, counter-revolutionaries, enemies of the state, enemies of progress, enemies of the glorious plan of the Chinese Communist Party to improve the lives of the Chinese people. And under the guise of that campaign, under the directions imposed by the senior male leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, 400 million unborn and in some cases newborn Chinese were eliminated over the years from 1980 to 2016 in the greatest destruction of human capital the world has ever seen. So that, of course, I think is the lens through which I have viewed China in the years since. And I think it is periodically reaffirmed if you're reading Chinese and if you're listening to what the Chinese leadership says, and not simply being entranced by the idea that you could have 1 billion customers in China if you only cooperated with the Chinese Communist Party, because that, my friends, is a literal pipe dream. The party considers the Chinese people to be kind of a renewable resource that it is free to exploit and exploit the resource to any extent they deem necessary. And with regard to us, of course, let's be clear about what the Chinese Communist Party has said about the United States and its long-term relationship with the United States. So going beyond the bland statements issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we read in May of 2019 in the People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's self-described mouthpiece of the party. In that May 2019 issue, the People's Daily declared a people's war against the United States. Now, what is a people's war? Just to be clear, a people's war is a total war. A people's war, according to the People's Liberation Army Daily, in an article that dated April 1st, 2023, a people's war, quote, is a total war. Its strategy and tactics require the overall mobilization of political, economic, cultural, diplomatic, military, and other power resources the integrated use of multiple forms of struggle and combat methods. Now, that's from the People's Liberation Army. And of course, it directly reflects the views of not just the People's Liberation Army, which is the militia, if you want to call it that, whose primary purpose is the defense of the Chinese Communist Party against all adversaries, including potentially the Chinese people themselves. So if China has declared a people's war against us, and you can go back and read earlier speeches by Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and Mao Zedong himself, of course, saying virtually the same thing, then we need to take that rhetoric seriously. If your enemy says you're at war, you're probably at war, whether you want to be or not. So I think the Chinese Communist Party is at war with us. It has used the principle of unrestricted warfare, which is a famous book in China written by two senior colonels back in 1999, but one of the colonels today is the senior general. So you see his views have been adopted by the Chinese Communist Party and are virtually official strategic doctrine now. So that's the view of the Chinese political and military elite. And I think we should, again, take that seriously. I was very heartened to hear the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, be very clear on the threat that the United States and indeed the world faces from the Chinese Communist Party. And he said very bluntly, and this is not a direct quote, but from memory, that the People's Republic of China has lied and cheated and stolen its way to becoming a first-rate superpower. But the days of abusing and misusing American generosity are over. And indeed, I think they are over. And as I will discuss, because of the internal contradictions of communism and its own mistakes, and because of the external pressure that China will now be facing from the United States and hopefully from our European allies, the Chinese system, like the system that ruled the Soviet Union, the former now gone Soviet Union, can be, I think, forced to implode upon itself, if not collapse entirely. So with that as a long, probably too long, introduction, let's talk about some of the problems that China faces today. You know, I've already mentioned the demographic problems brought on by the one-child policy, but just to underline that, China is now facing a steep decline in its population with no relief in sight. You know, leaving aside the official corruption and the mismanagement of the economy, and official corruption, let me just say in passing, the Chinese Communist Party probably consumes directly a third of all the wealth of China produced by the hardworking, industrious Chinese people who really deserve better than what they're getting at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. Probably 1/6, I calculated it once, that about 1/6 of China's GDP goes to support the Chinese Communist Party, to pay for the salaries, to pay for the lodging, to pay for the limousines, to pay for the foreign junkets, the resorts, the banquets, and so forth. So 1/6 of the economy of China is used to support the 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, even at the village level. I mean, the commune leaders, the brigade leaders under the commune system in 1980 when I was there, ate far better than the ordinary people did, who were living in houses just down the lane. and everyone knew that. And corruption takes about a sixth of the GDP of China. You can almost precisely estimate the net worth of individuals in the Chinese Communist Party hierarchy by what position they occupy in the hierarchy of power in China. If they're a county party secretary, they're probably worth a few million. If they're a prefectural party secretary, it's some tens of millions. If they're a provincial party secretary, it's some hundreds of millions. The senior officials, of course, are worth billions. Way back in 2012, we learned that Wen Jiabao, who had been premier from 2002 to 2012, and who had made the mistake of crossing the incoming leader, Xi Jinping, his net worth was revealed by the New York Times to be over $2 billion. That on a salary of roughly $5,000 a month. I mean, he's either the greatest investment genius in world history, or he's been taking bribes to promote generals from 3 stars to 4 stars, for example. There's actually a pay scale for getting promoted in the People's Liberation Army as well. So you see that corruption is endemic at all levels. One might say it has been endemic in in Chinese history because of the simple fact that the Chinese emperors, almost from the beginning, Qin Shi Huangdi in 220 BC, could not afford to pay from the central government coffers the salaries of the mandarins that they sent to rule the provinces and the counties of China, several thousand counties. And so every mandarin appointed by the emperor to rule a certain territory was allowed to collect taxes, and he had to collect taxes in sufficient quantity to support his yamen, his official residence, which was a law court and an administrative center, and ran the police force all in one. And of course, bribes were very much a part of that system from the very beginning, and still is today. So, I mean, corruption is massive, and it takes away a third of the Chinese economy in largely non-productive ways. Much of the money gathered by Chinese officials is sent offshore. That's why property values in Sydney and Melbourne and in Vancouver, where I'll be in a couple of months speaking, along the west coast of the United States and elsewhere, have gone up. That's why every elite communist family has at least one son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter in a country enjoying the benefits of the rule of law to protect the family assets in case something goes south in China, and they can then retreat to their safe haven overseas, courtesy of the United States, the Five Eyes, basically. So the crushing of creativity and innovation in the name of control. Why would you ever spend $1 billion inventing something in China if you could simply steal it from the United States or from another Western country by paying a few $1 million in bribes? If you did innovate something in China, you might very well find that the local party official would come in and say, I want to be your silent partner. I want, a third of the profits or more. The debt that China has run up, 350% of GDP, probably, maybe more. The level of debt is simply unknown because local officials and local branches of the People's Bank and the other 4 major banks in China have been conspiring for years in another form of expropriating the wealth of the Chinese people, and that is to say, how to introduce this topic. The cities in China, of course, are surrounded by villages, and the villagers have lived there for centuries and have been given leases on their land. All of the land in China is owned by the state. Well, local party officials will simply go to a village at the outskirts of the city and say, the city needs your land, and we're going to take the land. And they take it and pay a nominal amount of money to the villagers. They then destroy the village homes. And on that site, they will build a commercial center, or they will build a high-rise apartment building, or they will build a small manufacturing complex, or all three. And when that construction is ongoing, that is a chance for graft and corruption, right? Because the local party official in charge will go to the local People's Bank, and they will together go to a local construction company, and they will use money borrowed from the bank to build whatever building they've decided, without doing any sort of market analysis, to build. And when the high-rise apartment building is completed, the villagers will be told, well, now you have to move in. You can move into the high-rise apartment building, but you have to pay us rent. During the construction process, everyone involved, the construction company, the party secretary, the People's Bank director, makes money under the table. So the buildings are shoddily constructed. The villagers wind up having the homes that they've lived in rent-free, probably inherited from their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and having to pay rent to the local, the little triumvirate who pulled off this scam. This has happened tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times in China. That's why China is so overbuilt today. That's why you have ghost cities. You have 65 million empty apartment buildings. So that's where the debt comes from, and the debt is simply unmanageable. But think about the wanton destruction of human capital by the Chinese Communist Party over the last 75 years. And I think this is the most intractable problem at all, because maybe you can manage to prevent the collapse of the economy, to prevent the financial sector from completely ceasing to function. But there's no way you can make up for the 400 million, the elimination of 400 million of the most productive, hardworking, enterprising people on the planet. Roughly half of each of the last two generations of Chinese never saw the light of day because of the one-child policy. And, you know, in 2016, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, headed by Xi Jinping, realized that they were facing a very intractable problem. Because in that year, 2016, they had a labor shortage of 4.1 million in China. And they realized that they'd better stop this one-child policy. It wasn't because of any moral compunctions about killing unborn children or newborn children, or the high suicide rates of Chinese women because they were forced into aborting their children. It was purely an economic decision. And I think they thought they could turn back on the production of babies in the same way that they had turned it off 36 years before. That actually is almost a quote from Chairman Mao Zedong, who back in 1958, several decades before the beginning of the one-child policy, said, we have a ministry to control the production of steel and the production of bicycles and the production of goods. He said, we need a ministry of family planning to control the production of human beings. Well, that was prophetic, because 22 years later, they did exactly that. The Chinese government relaxed the one-child policy in 2016, expecting a baby boom. They got a boomlet, which quickly went away. A couple of years later, they said you can now have 3 children. They didn't get any boomlet at all. The birth rate continued to fall. Sichuan province now and a couple of other provinces have said to the Chinese people, you're now free to have as many children as you want. And the Chinese people have basically said, we don't want any or more than one. The Chinese Bureau of National Statistics finally admitted last year, 2 years ago, in fact, that China has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. The official birth rate is 1.09 children per woman, which is half of that needed to replace the current population. I think the real numbers may be even lower than that. Chinese officials exaggerate their successes and hide their failures, so the exact number is hard to come by. A friend of mine, a University of Wisconsin demographer, Professor Yi, says that China's population is actually not 1.4 billion. It's actually more like 1.3 billion. 100 million, 130 million people is not a rounding error. How does that happen? Well, elementary schools exaggerate the number of students so they can get more subsidies from the state. Hospitals exaggerate the number of patients so they can get more subsidies from the state, and so on and so forth. And you have a ripple effect. By the time the numbers are collated at the national level, you have huge errors in one way or another. So China's population is falling. China now admits that. It's actually been falling now for several years. It took them a while to come around to admit the truth. So China is still a middle-income country with hundreds of millions of people living in abject poverty. There's a real chance that China will have another famine in the next year or two because so many of the workers from China's villages who found factory jobs are now losing those factory jobs as the factories close and being sent back to villages which simply can't support them. So the Chinese Communist Party, because of corruption, because of the misallocation of resources, because of the one-child policy, is facing, I think, a whole series of intractable problems, any one of which would be difficult to overcome. All taken together, I think, is a recipe for disaster. You cannot correct the misallocation of resources. For example, you have high-speed rail throughout China. China Rail is in billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. They overbuilt the high-speed rail system. Receipts from ticket sales do not begin to cover the cost of financing that debt, much less making a profit, and so on and so forth. So what do we get? What is the conclusion about who will dominate the 21st century? Well, let me just give you one possible outcome. I don't believe the 21st century, because of these shortcomings on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, because of their mismanagement of the economy. I believe that China's population, and I agree with Professor Yi in this regard. Professor Yi, by the way, has been viciously criticized by the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda outlets, which probably suggests to me that he's very close to the mark. Professor Yi's projections, which I endorse, show that China's population, if they can stabilize the fertility rate at 1.1 children per woman, will decline to 440 million by 2100. I think that the rising reluctance of young Chinese women, the ongoing economic recession in China, the loss of jobs and financial security for tens of millions of Chinese, the high youth unemployment rate, which is probably around 30 or 40%. The Chinese government says it's in the teens, but it was in the 20s before they redefined it, what unemployment was. So they're trying to cover up that as well. I think the fertility rate will come to approximate Hong Kong's current 0.8 children per woman. If that's the case, there'll only be 310 million people alive in China at the end of the century. The aging and dying of China's population is creating huge strains on the country already. And because of that, America's population is 340 million or so. We don't know. It may be a couple of million less after the next couple of years, after some of the illegal migrants go home. But we still get 1.1 legal migrants coming into the country every year. By the year 2060, the population of the United States is projected to be 417 million. and it will surpass that of China in the decades coming. And we haven't even talked about the possibility that that President Trump will impose higher tariffs on China. I think the initial tariffs are going to be 10%. Some people are saying, well, he said he might impose tariffs up to 60% on China. I think people need to understand that the 10% is just the opening ante in a high stakes poker game. We have other issues on the table than simply the balance of trade. We have the issue of China's support for Iran, the biggest terrorist organization in the world right now. Without China, Hamas would not have attacked Israel. Without China's support, Putin perhaps would have had to think again about his assault on Ukraine. Without China, the North Korean economy would probably collapse. So we have other issues on the table. We also have the repatriation of illegal Chinese migrants here, which I'm sure he's hoping to get Xi Jinping to agree to. So there are lots of issues. So the tariffs can always be raised in the future and probably will. So I've probably gone on sufficiently about China's problems. I hope I've convinced you that that China's problems are intractable. What is China to do about the corruption? It really can't do anything. And I know there's been an anti-corruption campaign run by Xi Jinping since he took office in 2012, different offices in 2013. But that was not a campaign to eradicate all corruption. That was a political purge of his opponents, which culminated a couple of years ago in the removal of the former President Hu Jintao from a session of the Central Committee, humiliating Hu Jintao, who had been his supporter from the very beginning, and indicating to the entire Communist Party as well as the Chinese population that he was in absolute control. So the corruption is intractable. And because the corruption is intractable, China will never be an innovation economy. And because it's not an innovation economy, it must steal intellectual property. And I think we're becoming a little smarter in the West about dealing with those kinds of problems. I think we're becoming a lot smarter about dealing with the largest digital Trojan horse in human history, known as TikTok, which is nominally based in Singapore, but is actually run by its parent company, ByteDance, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. So we will deal with those problems, and we will stop the espionage and the theft of intellectual property, which again will cripple China's rise. So as far as the number of Chinese people, could China embark upon a program of forced reproduction? Could they, in a sense, turn the one-child policy on its head and say to young Chinese women, you will bear children? I don't think they would have any moral compunctions about doing that. Whether or not they would succeed or not is really becoming rapidly irrelevant at this point, because after all, it takes 20 years or so from conception, gestation, and birth to produce the most valuable resource at all, the human resource, a human being. It takes about 20 years to bring them into production. So China is rapidly reaching the point where even forced reproduction will not solve its problem. So that too is intractable. I have many friends in China. I wish for a better future for the Chinese people, but that will not happen as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in control of the country. And I do not believe the world can ever be truly at peace as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power in China. And therefore, I believe our policy ought to be the destruction of the Chinese Communist Party and the end of its misrule of the Chinese people. After all, it's the biggest killing machine in human history. And ironically enough, it has killed off its own future, I believe, and the China dream, if we simply stay strong against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen.